Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It is a snowy Monday afternoon here in suburban Chicago. As happened a couple weeks ago, my daughter is in her swim workout, and so I have some time to kill. I decided to go for a walk. It's 16 degrees Fahrenheit here, so a little warmer than last time I tried this, but still pretty chilly. I did dress better though. I have mittens on instead of cheapo gloves, and I have a better jacket and a nice robust scarf. So I'm just going to stroll around the parking lot a little bit and talk to you about some games. So my wife and I last night finished a campaign of Arkham Horror, the card game, which we began quite a while ago. We started it in the summer, and we got 6 of the 8 adventures played, and then things got away from us, and we never played the last 2. So we decided to go back and finish up the campaign and see what would happen. The campaign we were playing was the Circle Undone, which is a sort of witchcraft magic themed campaign. But now that we're done, I realized I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Arkham Horror, and I realized I've never done a Message from the Deep. So today we are going to do a Message from the Deep, Arkham Horror, the card game. For those of you who haven't heard one before, Message from the Deep is my in-depth review segment. I don't do it very often, but when I've played a game enough that I feel like I can give a kind of authoritative discussion of my thoughts on the game, then I will sometimes do a Message from the Deep episode, like I'm doing right now. Arkham Horror card game is something I've been excited about since the beginning. I bought the first game of it pretty early in the cycle and enjoyed it enough that I told my local game store to start ordering the game for me on the regular, and I've been subscribed ever since. It is a card-based adventure game in which players represent, in the standard Fantasy Flight style Arkham adventure game, players represent an investigator into the mysterious events occurring in and around the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts, the setting for many of H.P. Lovecraft's creepy stories. In any of the Arkham Files games, you generally play an investigator, and you're often working with a team of other investigators to figure out what happened or what's going on in various mysterious and scary ways. In Arkham Horror, the card game, you play an investigator and you engage in a series of scenarios connected to a discussion connected to these mysterious happenings. The way the game is actually played, you start by building a deck of 30 cards built around your character's class. So there are 5 different classes. You could be a guardian, you could be a seeker, you could be a rogue, you can be a there's 2 more. I don't know. Orange one and purple one. Purple one are mystic, and the orange are knowledge people. I don't know what the name of that class is called. But you build a deck of 30 cards that give you a variety of resources and skills, and each character has 4 traits that allow you to do tests. The scenarios are built around these cards, and it has a double mechanism. They have agendas and they have acts. The acts are the things the player is trying to do. You're trying to complete the acts of the story. That's ACTS. And generally you do that by resolving various kinds of puzzles, accumulating clues, which are scattered throughout the game, and then spending those clues to advance the story. Generally, the act part of the story are the things that the investigators are doing to solve the mystery. On the other side, you have the agenda, which represents the evolution of the evil, monstrous, malevolent entities part of the story, and that advances usually as a kind of game timer. So generally what you're trying to do is you're trying to do the good stuff, fend off the bad things before the timer progresses so much that the game ends with a bad resolution. What makes this so much fun and so much different than a lot of the other Arkham games is the campaign mode. While you can play any individual scenario as a one-off, generally it's recommended that you play as a campaign, starting with the scenario at the beginning and keeping track as you play through 7 or 8 adventures. With each you get experience, which allows you to swap out some of the cards in your deck for stronger cards. It allows you to develop an ongoing story and reach one of a number of different conclusions. Most adventures have 2 or 3 different resolutions, depending on how well you do. And over time, your options and your end states open up or close based on the choices that you made during the adventure. And sometimes not the choices, but rather where you succeeded and where you failed. In its primary state, Arkham Horror is a pretty difficult game, but overall, there's a lot of fun to it. So having given you a sense of what the game is now, I thought I would talk a little bit about 5 things I like and 4 things that I don't like or potentially could be negatives for some people. Maybe 5 things to like about the game and 5 things that are potential negatives about the game. So to start with, actually it's going to be 4 negatives, so I'm starting and ending with a positive. So start with the variety of characters. One of the things I really like about the Arkham Horror card game, which feels like it carries over from Fantasy Flight's efforts with Android Netrunner, another favorite of mine, is that the characters in the Arkham files have a wide diversity of backgrounds and ethnicities, even despite the setting of being 1920s America. So you can play characters of a variety of different races and economic classes. There are a couple characters that have an implied LGBTQ identity. I don't know if there are any that explicitly do. I would have to check. But being that it's 1920s, it would be an interesting bit of narrative to try to figure out how to express that in a way that would have been societally acceptable for 1920s Massachusetts. Each character has their own little backstory. They have their own special power that they can do, and they have their own weakness that always goes into their deck. For instance, most recently, on my most recent campaign, I played Rita Young, who is a African-American track star, and was constantly being chased by some evil people that were trying to capture her for some reason, or were tormenting her for some reason. There's a heavy implication there that she's being chased because she's successful and black. If nothing else, that the villains, although described as Arkham cultists, they're depicted in outfits that look somewhat clan-like, and they're called hoods. So Rita finds herself constantly chased by these malevolent, almost racist characters, and she stands up to them in a pretty satisfying way. Although admittedly, it's a kind of trite treatment of race relations in the United States. Another character I played was Jim Culver, a jazz musician who had made a deal with the devil. So his special thing was that you could play his trumpet and get lots of bonuses. But his negative was that it took a toll on his soul to have given away his soul to the devil. But there are a variety of characters for you to choose from. And if you've been collecting the game for a while, as I have, I probably have 20 or 30 different characters I can pick. Maybe 5 in each type of character. So lots of options when you're playing. I will say, as long as we're talking about sort of social issues, or I did mention that there for a minute, one of the downsides to the Arkham Horror games is that they are built around H.P. Lovecraft's mythos. I've talked before on the podcast, and I'll put a link in there to the specific episodes where I talk about this, that H.P. Lovecraft was a really unpleasant figure who espoused racist views and whose views get integrated into his stories in really insidious ways. I think that enough authors have engaged with the story world that he started and built it, that for me at least, there is a separation from the author of the creative space and an engagement with these ideas in really significant ways that make it palatable to play a game, even if they are inspired by the writings that he gave. Nonetheless, depending how much you're able to separate art from the artist, it's worthwhile remembering that. The Arkham Files games all kind of come from the same root. Back to the positives, another positive thing I like about the game is the deck building, or the deck construction. Here I'm using a rather stupid separation between the phrase deck construction and deck building. Often in board games, deck building is used to describe games where, as you play, you change the deck, which is not the case for this game. Instead, a deck construction game is one where, before you start playing, you go through a series of cards and you choose eligible cards and put them in your deck. Thus, you construct the deck you're going to play with. It's something like Magic or Netrunner or Arkham Horror, you pick 30 cards that you're going to play with, and you put them into your deck. That's kind of that's the model of this game. I think the deck building is really fun. Often the decks have unique options. Like, for instance, my wife on our last adventure played Carolyn Fern, the psychologist, who was interestingly a guardian character, which is usually a kind of combat-oriented figure, but her character wasn't allowed to take weapons, but she was allowed to take all the other stuff that guardians did. And then she had access to a bunch of other spells involving getting rid of horror. So she had a great set of options for building a really unique deck, or a unique deck, as compared to the kinds of limitations that some of the more straightforward characters have, where they say you can take any cards from this one class and only a couple cards from these other classes or whatever. I find the deck building really fun, and if you are able to decide on a kind of theme or idea for your deck, often you can find really great stuff. Using tools like Arkham DB that allow you to search all the text on all the cards helps you find which cards do what, and you can also use that to find deck lists if you're not somebody who wants to spend your time doing that part of the creative work. But yeah, I think the deck building is pretty fun. Although I don't do it as much as I did with something like Netrunner, because for me, testing a deck by playing it once or twice isn't really something I would do so much in Arkham Horror, but it is something I would do in Netrunner. So I'm less likely to build decks unless I'm going to play with them. Nonetheless, I will say a related downside to that is that the game is pretty time consuming. Building a deck is a matter of hours of work between, like, if I'm using an online tool like Arkham Database to sort through cards and choose a deck, I will do that. But then it still takes probably another hour or so at least to sort through all the cards and find the cards that I need for the deck that I've now built. On top of that, sometimes I'm not easily able to grasp the concept of the cards when I'm looking at them online. There's something about the tactility of it that I really like. So often when I'm building a deck, I'll sit down with my cards and I'll just go through them and look at the cards that are there and kind of choose things that way. It's not as efficient, but it is really fun if you like that sort of thing. But I'm offering this as one of the negatives. It's very time consuming. Then the game itself actually runs pretty long. Now, I think it runs longer when my wife and I play it than most people. We can come back to that, and I will. But either way, it's a fairly complicated setup. It takes 10 or 15 minutes, depending on the game, to sort out all the cards and put them in the right spots. I may exacerbate that issue because I sort my cards rather than leaving them in the plastic boxes until it's time to play them. So maybe some of that's on me. Nonetheless, the game is somewhat time consuming. The next thing I like about the game is that it has perhaps the best theme and mood that I've ever encountered in a game. And I'm not here talking about the Lovecraftian nature of it. I'm talking about how they build the idea of the game. From the little components that you have, you get these little clue tokens and these little skulls, and these hearts and brains have a kind of gruesome aspect to them. Now, our plays are even more gruesome because I've purchased the top shelf games enhanced pieces. So we have like little tiny skulls instead of skull tokens, and we have little tiny hearts and little tiny brains instead of tokens for brains and hearts. But even that aside, all of these cards are chock-a-block full of really interesting artwork that makes for dramatic gameplay and exciting experiences, and I think just give the overall game a sense that is really great. Also, the cards often have mood language on them, some of which is drawn directly from Lovecraft, some of which mimics his style in really significant ways. And as a result, I think the game, it really sets the mood nicely. We usually play with some creepy music playing too, and it's just, it's excellent. I will also say the theme, which I'll come back to, but the way that different elements of gameplay invoke the theme really works well. And as a result, I strongly recommend. That's one of my favorite things about the game, is the great mood that it uses. Future Brendan here. This episode of Pick Up and Deliver ended up being very long. So instead of giving you a really, really long episode, I'm going to break it into two pieces. So this will be part one of my episode, and will be followed by part two. Thanks for joining me.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.